everybody. So I've been thinking some more about this teaching of no preferences in the Xinxinming and in Zhaozhou's teachings. I guess when you first hear about it, it sounds like a teaching of sacrifice and renunciation. Give up all the stuff you like. Endure all the stuff you don't like. Even if this were actually possible, it doesn't sound like that much fun. Maybe it would be more peaceful, but it sounds like it would be kind of without passion, without color. And it's very hard to imagine a life without preferences. And I think a reasonable person might conclude on balance that a certain amount of suffering and trouble is worth, the benefit from keeping your preferences. I think a lot of Dharma students hear this teaching and they think, but then they think, well, you know what? Actually, my life is pretty good. I can keep my preferences. It's really not hurting anybody. I guess you could say that the number one preference is self. In fact, maybe that is what preference actually is, self. And who can imagine life without the self? Supposedly the Buddha said no self and all that. Well, that's another one. That sounds nice, but actually I'm okay. Because no self. It sounds kind of spooky. No self. You imagine it. No self is a giant black hole with nothing in it, or maybe like you're in it. A big hole, and you're the only thing in it, and it's really scary in there. That's no self. So similarly, you try to imagine no preference, like no self. This seems like very bleak, and the reason it seems that way to us is because our very preferences and our very self is already imagined. And this imagination is so limited and one-sided and inherently distracting that it makes it impossible to actually imagine anything else. And the whole idea here is, let's stop imagining this way what we think we're living, and actually live what's really happening. And when you do, all these problems disappear instantaneously. Living beyond preferences is actually pretty easy. And living life as life, rather than insisting at every point on myself, is also pretty easy, and not only easy, but far more pleasant and far more beautiful, because it's so big and vast. And little by little, through the process of our practice, we learn how to live that life. And despite all the many books written about this, there is no way to do this. All the books are fooling us, I mean, with good intentions, but still, because there's no way to do this. You just do it. And you are doing it, little by little. on the one hand, there is so little to this that it might seem disappointing. What? This is all it is? But when you stop all of that thinking and just pay attention to what it actually is, it is very wondrous. And as we were saying already about the Xinxinming, you realize that even though he starts out by saying the true ways without difficulty, just avoid all preferences, what he's really talking about is living reality as it truly is, seeing things as they really are. And the point of the preferences is that they are getting in the way. They are literally blocking the view, and you don't see. So it's really not a matter of giving something up that's really good and that you want. It's just a matter of seeing what's actually there, right in the middle of your life. Beautifully and wonderfully there, but you didn't see it. And that's the main point of everything in practice. There's only one thing in practice. We just keep repeating really the same thing over and over again. Tim says it, I say it, Chris says it, everybody says it. They say it in the sutras, they say it in the koans. It's only one thing. Many different ways of speaking about this one thing. And actually, Tim talked about it really beautifully yesterday. And when I was listening to him, I thought, oh, those are all the things that I was going to say today. I was going to say all those things. Then he would say another thing. I said, yeah, that's what I was going to say, too. So that's good. I don't have to say as much.
You're off the hook.
Yeah, I'm off the hook. You already did it, so I don't have to. We can just remember all the things that he said yesterday. I'm going on from there. So just briefly, to review, he spoke about two truths. Remember, the relative and the absolute. And he gave you many, many different names for them, because there's a million different names. Phenomena and reality, form and emptiness, historical reality and ultimate reality. All kinds of names. So the preferences exist in the world of phenomena, the world of form. Form, by the way, in the Heart Sutra, as I guess you know, it doesn't just mean form. When you hear the Heart Sutra saying form is emptiness, form is this and that, it means form, feelings, perceptions, formations, consciousness. The five skandhas, and it just says form for short, rather than listing the five skandhas every time it says form, but it means all five. And the five skandhas describe the human experience of the phenomenal world. So that's where we live. It's the only place a person with a body and a mind could live is in the phenomenal world. There's no other place to be. But the problem is we are mistaking the phenomenal world for a very limited, one-dimensional world, because we're only seeing it through the blinders of the self, and we don't have any other way of seeing it. So that's one side. And the other side is the empty side, the absolute side, the real side, the ultimate side, whatever you want to call it, the side of non-self, beyond self, beyond preference. And Zen usually emphasizes this side a lot because this is the side we're deficient in. So that's why we have to sit down on our cushion for a while till we really get it, that there is nothing that is fixed, that everything is coming and going in a very radical way. And that really you can't find a beginning or even an ending. Every single thing is beyond itself. You are beyond yourself. Your true nature is literally and exactly beyond compare. Suzuki Roshi calls this absolute value. And how sad that we judge ourselves and find ourselves lacking. Of course we're lacking. We really are. You know, if you have self-judgment and you think, I'm just such an idiot, you're right. Yes, all our self-judgments, all our punishing self-judgments, they're all true. Of course we're lacking. The self that can be judged will never pass judgment. No matter how good you could be, you'll never pass this punishing judgment. But that's not who you are. That's just the clothing you wear. The self you really are is beyond all that. Magnificent. 60,000 foot cliff, like they say, in ancient times. And yet, at the same time, we are all these poor little human beings crawling around on the surface of the earth. It's kind of sweet, really. All of us wounded people skulking around, looking askance at one another. And we're all Buddhas. We're all beautiful. It's kind of stunning. And this is what the ancient teachers are talking about. How am I doing, Stan? Still more? How's that? Good. This is what the ancient teachers were always talking about, Stan. They're talking about how are you going to figure out how to live in this world of relative and absolute form and emptiness, historical reality, phenomenal reality, and the ultimate, without falling over on one side or falling over on the other side. If we fall over into the side of the ultimate, we're stuck in a cave of emptiness. And we're going to miss our actual life. This is a kind of sweet and benign nihilism. On the other hand, if we get stuck in the relative, then we're spun around by our likes and our dislikes and all the pain of the world. So we cannot take ourselves too seriously. On the other hand, we cannot ignore ourselves either. So you see the problem. This is the problem, right? And I'm thinking about this today very specifically because Daikon told me that he was going to give a Dharma talk on Dongshan's 5 ranks, which is one of the many schemes you can find in Buddha Dharma for talking about this question of the relative and the absolute. There's 1,000 different ways they talk about it, and this is one of them. Daikon used to study the koan curriculum in Rinzai Zen, in which, after you pass your more or less 1,700 koans, you come to the pinnacle of the study, which is Dongshan's 5 ranks. And so that's why Daikon decided he would give a Dharma talk about Dongshan's 5 ranks, which Dogen didn't like very much. Dogen didn't like, some places he says, I don't like this teaching. Plenty of things Dogen didn't like. He had some preferences. He didn't like the 5 ranks. And because I think, I don't know if he says exactly why, but I think maybe because they're so heady. And I have inherited that prejudice from Dogen. We all do that. We inherit the prejudices of our teachers. Hopefully not taking them too seriously, but just seriously enough to maintain the family connection. Anyway, I've inherited that preference for no, not the 5 ranks. And it's possible that in my record of Dharma talks, however many of them there are by now, 10,000, you probably won't find any references to the 5 ranks, because I never talk about them until today because of Daikon. So this is my Dharma talk for Daikon. And I bring up the 43rd case of Blue Cliff Record, which is about this. A monk asks Dongshan, when cold and heat come, how can we avoid them? Dongshan said, why don't you go somewhere where there is no heat or cold? And the monk says, where is that? And Dongshan says, when it's cold, the cold kills you. When it's hot, the heat kills you. So I'm sure you all know this story. It's a little story about how do we live in the midst of the relative and the absolute. It's also, not incidentally, a story about how we practice with our preferences. We don't have to deny the relative to get to the absolute. Because we get to the absolute through the relative. There isn't any other way. Now, to be sure, after all I've said, and after all that Tim said yesterday, let's be clear that there is no such thing as relative and absolute. There are words, relative and absolute, but they don't really refer to anything. We don't live in a relative world and an absolute world. We live in one big, buzzing, booming, colorful world that is beyond any of these concepts. I don't know if there's a rule here, but most zendos have a rule. Don't adjust the temperature. If you're cold, don't go over to the thermostat and turn it up. If you're hot, don't open the window. Speak to the Ino, those famous words. Speak to the Ino. The Ino will take care of it. Why? Because one person's cold is the other guy's hot, right? And one person's hot is the other guy's cold. Anyway, if it gets to be perfect, enjoy it. Usually it's too hot, a little bit or a lot, or too cold, a little bit or a lot. But every now and then, if it's just right, you should enjoy it because it won't last more than a second. So where do we go to escape this problem? Well, there's only one place to go. Right here. In the heat, in the cold. Don't long for another condition. Don't attach to this condition. The only thing is take the backward step into this condition as it is. And let this condition finish you off. Let this condition as it is, like it or not, dissolve your self-clinging. In the commentary to the story, there's a great image that's used many times in Zen of a gourd floating on the water. You push the gourd down and it pops right up. And when it pops up, you don't know which way it's going to pop up. This way, that way. It pops up. What side? We don't know. Reality is just like that. Enlightenment, suffering, bliss, pain, wonder, anguish, you never know what the next moment is going to bring. But a Zen student learns how to live, always ready to let go and face the moment. Well, in talking about this case, Yuanwu, who's the commentator in the Blue Cliff Record, brings up Dongshan's 5 ranks. And he quotes the famous 5 poems, that one for each rank, and I'm going to quote them for you now. Each poem is titled by its rank. Rank is a kind of funny translation here. They're not so much ranks as if they were stages, as they are ways of thinking about the same thing from different conceptual vantage points. So here are the 5 poems. The first one, the first rank, and these are Thomas Cleary's translations of the poems, is called The Bias Within the Correct. So this is the relative within the absolute. And this is when the dominant mood is deep serenity, and the phenomenal world appears at peace within that serenity. This may seem like the goal, the truth, but actually it's the first blush, the beginning. In our practice, to realize the truth is the beginning. That's when you begin. And then you go on from there. And here's the poem. In the middle of the first night, before the moon shines, no wonder when they meet, they don't recognize one another. Each is hidden, still embracing the aversion of former days. So you might have noticed that the phenomenon of go through sesshin, you really feel peaceful and happy. Everything is really good. You walk out the door, you go home, and the first thing that happens makes you so angry. You're ready to kill somebody. You can't believe that that just happened. Because everything is tranquil and peaceful and wonderful. The aversion of former years hasn't entirely gone away yet. The second rank is the correct within the biased. And this is when we emphasize the phenomenal world, but now we understand that the phenomenal world is more than it appears to be. So here's the poem on the correct within the biased. At dawn, an old woman encounters an ancient mirror. Clearly, she sees her face. There is no other reality. Don't go on mistaking the image for the head. The third rank is called coming from within the correct. And this is when, after we appreciate the relative more than we did before, because we see it more clearly, we now can more fully inhabit the absolute. Here's the poem. With nothingness, there's a road out of the dust, the world's dust. With nothingness, there's a road out of the dust. If you can just avoid violating the present taboo name, you'll still surpass the eloquent ones of former dynasties who silenced every tongue. So a lot of the Zen poems include references that are very well known to Chinese readers familiar with Chinese classics, but obscure and mysterious to us. In this case, it refers to the fact that the emperor apparently, exactly like God in the Hebrew Bible, had taboo names, names that were not to be pronounced. Probably you could be killed if you pronounced the emperor's taboo name, or maybe nobody knew the taboo name for their own protection. Very similar to what you read in the Bible. So this poem has to do with how we understand the depths of language in us, how deeply language and concept condition us and trip us up. Having seen and now investigated the absolute, you will see this point very well. And you can see through your own habitual thinking. And then you will speak about things and think about things very differently. And the next is the other side of this, the arrival within the biased. Now you can take up the relative world on its own terms. Forget about the absolute. Nonsense. All the zazen and the incense, why bother with all that? There's things to take care of. Forget it. Do what needs to be done. That's what this poem is about. When two swords cross points, there's no need to withdraw. A good hand is like a lotus in the fire. Clearly, he has the energy to reach the heavens. We say this at the end of our meals. Like a lotus in muddy water. The lotus is a flower that literally blooms out of the mud. It goes beyond, as we chant. It rises up above the leaves of the plant that are rooted literally in mud. In India, at least when I was there in the 1990s, running on dirt roads alongside fields, there would be ditches with muddy water in them, and there would be wild lotus flowers, lotus plants growing in those ditches with beautiful lotus flowers. And the reason we say the lotus in the mud is because the food that we're eating is messy. It looks nice on the plate, but then we start chewing it, and we make it into this gooey ick, right? Which fortunately we can't see. And then it leads into a very messy process of digestion, which, thank God, the body is not transparent. If we looked at each other digesting our food, I think we would all rush out of the room, aghast. But that is not the end of the story. Then there's pooping and peeing and the many attendant sewage issues involved here. We're in the world we live in now, like you never think about such things, right? Here we have septic tanks and leach fields, just as at our house we have septic tanks and leach fields that we are responsible for, and sometimes they don't work, right? And then this is the problem. So I am now personally aware, very aware, that every piece of food I eat might later become something that I have to scrape out of my bathtub. Which I have done. Somehow that's my job. I don't know why that's my job. Kathy doesn't do that. I somehow have that job. So I am well aware of this lotus in muddy water problem. So that is the reality of eating food. On the other hand, look what we do with this food. Look what we have done with this food. We have manufactured a lotus flower, a beautiful flower, not to mention whole cities shining in the light, and our lives full of love and beauty and drama and Dharma, thanks to this food. So in this case, the lotus is in the fire, and the fire is the passionate fire of the world. This lotus does not burn up in the fire. It is not consumed in the fire. Taking care of the phenomenal world on its own terms, we go beyond the phenomenal world. The next poem is Arrival Within, Both at Once. And this one is just living peacefully and quietly, just taking care of things easily and naturally as they come up, and maybe taking a little rest, a little contemplation. Maybe you do a little zazen once in a while. Fully integrating the most profound teachings into the simple actions of life. Here's the poem. She does not fall into being or non-being. Who can match her? Everyone wants to get out of the ordinary flow. But after all, she returns and sits in the ashes. Sits in the ashes means everything is complete already. This raging fire is already burned out. Everything is cool and clear. Life is sad. Yes, it is. Because everything passes. But life is joyful. Yes, it is. Because everything that passes arises. Then, Yuan Wu comments further on this, and he says this. When Dongshan says, why don't you go to the place where there is no cold or hot, this is the correct within the bias. When the monk says, where do I go? And Dongshan says, when it's cold, the cold kills you. When it's hot, the heat kills you. This is the biased within the correct. Well, I leave it to you to sort all that out. And already you're thinking it through, right? This is the problem, exactly, with the 5 ranks. It's the problem with any wonderful system of trying to work out these teachings reasonably and intellectually. If you care about the teachings, this is all like slightly too interesting. A little too interesting. Too easy to lose yourself in it. I can see why Dogen didn't like it. But then, I could also see that someone might well complain that reading Dogen is no better than that anyway. It's also, I get lost in that. And if you like it, it's a little too interesting, right? A little too heady sometimes. One must always make sure not to lose the forest for the trees, or is that the other way around? Not to lose the trees and get lost in the forest, or climb up the tree and get tangled in the branches, or fall out of the tree and hurt yourself or something, I don't know. So let's not think about any of this. I was just doing this because Daigon made me think about it. And anyway, I had to say something today, and I didn't want to just say all the same thing that I said yesterday. So. Forget it, please. Study your preferences. That's the important thing. Study your preferences very closely. See how it is that you get caught in them. Notice how self is created through preference. Sometimes people say to me, well, I'm the kind of person who, and then they have a thing, but they say they're this kind of person. And I say to them, I don't say this, I mean, I think to myself, you really? You are the kind of person who? Do you know the kind of person you are? Really? You're ahead of me. I have no idea the kind of person I am, who. Why don't you just be surprised at the kind of person you are today? Why don't you just be mystified by yourself? Shocked sometimes by yourself. Rather than think you have yourself figured out because you knew your mother and father. I think there's more to you than that. So forget the 5 ranks. Excuse me, please, for bringing it up. Please forget about it and just practice. Pay attention. It's that simple. Pay attention. When you sit down, pay attention to your body and breathe. Feel the body, feel the breath, come back again and again. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to everybody else. Be generous in your view of yourself and everybody else. And trust everything that happens to you. And with an unbiased hand and eye, do what you can and see what happens next. We are very, very lucky to be alive. So I'm going to close with a few quotations, some paragraphs from my teacher, Zoketsu Roshi, whose posthumous book, maybe you know, called Seeing One Thing Through, is just out. This is the way it always is, isn't it? Now that he's gone, I'm really sorry that for the last 25 or 30 years, I have not paid as much attention to his teachings as I should have. So I'm trying to make up for it now by quoting him on every opportunity. And I think you'll recognize in what he's saying right now exactly the practice of the 5 ranks. This is how he talks about it without any of this fancy stuff. You'll hear very clearly. So these are his words. Our Zen practice is very simple, and yet the focus is easy to miss. As a matter of fact, it's so simple that sometimes we don't see what's right under our feet or our nose. To be able to take hold of and seize this moment and not get lost in the world, not give way to confusion and doubt, is pretty difficult. And yet, this simple practice is not so difficult if we always question, where am I and what am I doing? This koan, what is it, is a koan for each one of us. I have always felt that this, what is it, was Suzuki Roshi's unstated koan for us. I could sometimes hear him saying this in a casual way, but loaded with meaning. If someone pointed something out to him, he might say, "Oh, what is it?" After all, what is this bow? How do we become aware of the absolute quality of our life in each moment's activity? It's maybe not so difficult to be aware of what we're doing. To be mindful is not so difficult. To be aware of the absolute quality of our life in each activity is easy to miss. How to express Buddha nature in the simplest acts of our life. How to express whole being, not just our personality. What is it? What is it? What is it? As Master Ganto says, the answer is always, this is it. If we can keep our attention on this is it, then we have our practice. It's not that we know something, but we express right understanding. I may not know what something is. I may know what something is, yet not know that this is it. Even though I don't understand it, I know it. And this is the last paragraph I'll quote from a different part of the book. And this is such a beautiful, extended metaphor for our practice life, and a wonderful thought for closing the Dharma talks of sesshin. Suzuki Roshi used to say that all of us are part of one being. When we are completely merged with reality, we're all part of the one complete being called Buddha. This is enlightenment. And we experience that through Zazen. But sitting cross-legged is just one form of Zazen. Zazen has many forms. We continually come back to the Zafu because sitting in Zazen is a most fundamental way of understanding or experiencing our nature. But there are many ways of practicing Zazen if we know what we are doing. It's really up to each one of us to find out how to practice in this way. Chasing enlightenment is like running across the desert. We can't wait to get to the other side. And that's why we're running. But you don't get very far that way. After a little while, we find it's just too hard to run. So then we try walking. And then it gets hot. And we start walking really slowly, one step at a time. And then we notice we're carrying too much stuff. So we have to leave it lying on the sand. Piece by piece, as we go, we unload our extra baggage as we take one step at a time. And finally, we find a comfortable way to get through the desert, walking steadily day after day. And it takes a long, long time. But luckily, from time to time, we come to an oasis. We drink the water, and it's so wonderful. And the oasis is a kind of awakening. And at some point, we have a wonderful refreshment that we call understanding. But you can't stay at the oasis. We leave it behind and continue on in the desert. Now, the desert is just as hot as it always was, but now we have some confidence because we went to an oasis and we know there's probably another one up ahead. And it dawns on us, this desert doesn't end. We're going to continue forever and ever in this desert. But it's rather nice because we now know how to walk in the desert. And we know how to do it continually. The only way we can do this continually is to bring forth a strong, true spirit. And if we can't bring forth that strong spirit, we cannot continue. So there's nothing else to do. We do it. And in the process, we find out that everything we need to know is right under each footstep. Not bad, huh? It's pretty good. Thank you. Zoketsu Roshi. So this has been a really wonderful session. I think maybe the best ever, I think. The best so far. And I've said that before.
It's true every time.
It's always true. It's always true. And really, it has been very wonderful for me to get to know some of you that I didn't know before, to get to know better. Some of you I knew a little bit, and always, as ever, to see again those of you whom I know well for a long time, who I deeply love and appreciate. So thanks everybody, especially Tim and Chris and Raisel and Desiree and all the other Red Cedar community leaders for taking care of us all so well. Thanks also to the community of Christ who feeds us so well, and I guess later on we'll have a chance to thank them for that. And provides this really special space, and not only them, but the peoples, as we honored the other day, who've come before them and made this into sacred ground. We've all been moved by this sesshin, and I know that every one of us is going to go forth into our lives with a little more wisdom and a little more strength than we had when we arrived, and we're going to share that with everyone we know, and we're going to be a blessing in this world. As for me, I'm going to Brooklyn from here, where I'm going to join Kathy, who's been having lots of fun with our children and grandchildren, a lot of school time off. So there's lots of fun to be had. So that's where I'm going. We do have the rest of today for our sitting. We can sit with ease and joy. Tomorrow morning we'll have one sit before breakfast and then our Shosan ceremony and then clean up and closing. I know a lot of you know the Shosan ceremony well, but just to say a word, some of you may not know it. This is a traditional Zen dialogue ceremony to conclude sesshin by hearing each person's unique voice expressing their own understanding in their own words. So this is a formal ceremony, and the specific form will be described in detail tomorrow. But the idea is that everybody bows, comes forward, and in a great, loud, clear voice with good enunciation so everybody can hear, and you're going to go like this. If you don't hear, then they'll speak up louder. They ask their serious Dharma question that expresses their concern, and then the teacher responds. You can, if you want, if it comes to you, ask a spontaneous follow-up question, but the encounter is short and pithy, and it goes quickly, one person after another, bing, bing, bing. The whole thing, even with this number of people, usually takes under an hour. And it's a wonderful ceremony. We would never have thought of such a thing, but our Asian ancestors are so wonderfully conversant with the practice, and they figured out that this would be a brilliant ceremony, a way of creating one teaching, summing up the entire experience of sesshin for all of us. And I'm mentioning this now so that without thinking about it too much, you will discover your Dharma question sometime between now and tomorrow morning. Maybe it occurs to you 2 minutes before it's your turn to come forward and bow, but sometime you'll discover your question. Okay. I do appreciate your practice very much. It gives me strength. So maybe I'll keep going. Yeah, I think so. Why not? It's good. Thank you.
May our intentions equally extend to every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow God's way is unsurpassable.